time. So I'm going to give you sort of, you know, an overview. This is by no means comprehensive, but I think as we look back over the last 5 years, I think, you know, I'm surprised at all of what we have been able to accomplish, facing some pretty significant headwinds. So here we go. I think the first thing I always do is we all have to agree what invasive species are, and I think that this is, you know, this is a group that knows better than anybody. So, but we all agree that they're non-native and they need to cause significant harm to the environment, economy, I should be in here too, or human health. And New York State has adopted the federal executive order, the federal definition of invasive species. I think we can all agree that they're actually a form of pollution, and we would call them biological pollution. And we bear in mind the numbers can be arguable, but about, you know, some 15% or so of non-native species actually are invasive. So non-native, as we know, does not mean necessarily invasive. There's many ways that they come to us, and when we had our 2-minute updates across the state, several of these pathways were mentioned. So they can come however we move people or product, we can move invasives. So any 5-year look back really has to look back at the beginning, and the beginning of the implementation that we're involved in now really was the Invasive Species Task Force that was established in statute in 2003, that group, and there's several folks on this call that were part of that group, and they investigated the invasive species in New York, and they developed a report and made 12 recommendations to the governor and the legislature. And all of those recommendations have informed how we arrive at where we are today. And that report is available on the DEC website, and there's the address there, but if you were to go to our DEC website, www.dec.ny.gov, and you just were to search for the Invasive Species Task Force report, you ought to come up with the page. So, and then, of course, if you're interested, you can always email me. So the Office of Invasive Species Coordination, and I am in that office with my colleague, Dave Adams. Our mission is to prevent or minimize the harm caused by invasives to New York, and the way that we do that is by collaborating and coordinating with all stakeholders across the state. And just yesterday, we sat down in the New York Power Authority office with probably 20 or so of their environmental managers, and we reached consensus on BMPs. And they thought it was going to be a very long, involved process, but you know, we'll work with any stakeholder on any pathway, and we'll do our best to work together and reach a place where we can work collaboratively to move New York ahead. The leadership structure, one of the recommendations of the task force was to establish a permanent leadership. That Invasive Species Task Force no longer exists, but it sort of evolved into the council, the Invasive Species Council, which are 9 state agencies with a stake in invasive species. It's co-led by DEC and Department of Ag and Markets. The advisory committee is a larger body that's advisory to the council, and that's 25 non-governmental stakeholder members. Some of them are specified in statute, and some of them are just simply described in statute. And Hillary Smith, who is the coordinator for APIP, is the chair of the advisory committee. Coordination, all of these efforts need to be well coordinated. And in the good old days, 18 months ago or so, there were 5 agency staff that provided coordination. One of them was in Ag and Markets, and 4 of them were here at DEC. And as you can see, we actually have 2 people left in DEC, and that's the full coordination complement now. We are effectively building a strategic system, and coordination and communication are keys to anything that we do. And you'll see that the regional partnerships are right in the center. The council and the advisory committee communicate back and forth, and every piece of the system communicates, the Research Institute, Education and Outreach Coordinator, and the Information Clearinghouse, and the locational database. And the regional partnership should be integrated into all those pieces. We're building and supporting partnerships for regional invasive species management. The good news is we have 4 of them under contract. Probably my biggest disappointment in my 5 years is that we still have 4 that are not. The RFP is closer than it's ever been. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of time to devote to doing the paperwork on that. There's some tweaks that need to be made. It is, frankly, sitting on my desk right now awaiting my attention again. So I'm just doing the best I can do under what we have to deal with. One of the pieces of our implementation is the invasive species database, and certainly all of you have opportunities to take training. It answers the questions of where are New York's invasives. It's online, it's GIS enabled, and it can be a critical tool in early detection. It certainly supports rapid response, and we have a special section on it for the hydrilla infestation in the inlet to Cayuga Lake, and we have information that's only available actually to select people on the feral hog, because we don't want the hunting public to go on this website and say, oh, I can go hunting feral hogs, here or there. We want to avoid that. So there is the capacity to have some of the information only available to a select group. Furthermore, that can certainly, you can track your control activities and results. And Jennifer Dean is in the same room with me, and she should have an opportunity later on to give a quick update. But there's a link on the opening slide to more information on when your PRISM trainings will be offered. The Invasive Species Research Institute, and Holly Menninger was the coordinator for that and has now left for another position. We have approval to extend our contract for another year once we sign it with Cornell, but that certainly provided an excellent service with an advisory committee, an experts database. Holly developed a white paper on Eurasian water milfoil management in New York that really does need to be distributed to a larger audience, especially those folks that are dealing with Eurasian water milfoil. She assisted with the New York Climate Change Report by NYSERDA, just released last year, and she was critical in our hydrilla response in Cayuga Lake Inlet, and I suspect that there's not one person on this call who has not had a conversation with Holly or been, benefited by her expertise. And so she is much missed, but I suspect Cornell will find a pretty good candidate to fill in behind her. The online invasive species clearinghouse, Chuck O'Neill, I suspect, is on this call. That website has been recently renovated. It you'll find fact sheets, information, links to PRISM websites, news and events, and just as of yesterday, a link to past PRISM call recordings and presentations. Education outreach, again, I think Chuck is probably on this call. That's our Cornell Cooperative Extension. That's the education outreach support for PRISMs and county associations. They don't step in and tell you how to do it, but they help you educate the partners on how to do education outreach and to develop your outreach efforts and to develop your outreach plans and assist and educate partners on your program evaluations. There are many separate efforts on separate education outreach efforts ongoing as well, but the Cornell Cooperative Extension contract is there to assist you, and as they ramp up their staffing, I suspect that we'll be hearing more from them. And of course, they have their annual outreach and education in service. A comprehensive plan, this is one of the elements of the Invasive Species Task Force recommendations. Last summer, Paul Furman, who's on the finalized the New York State Invasive Species Strategy. It's really not a comprehensive plan. It made recommendations that we use the national model, that we approach invasives through pathways, that we increase awareness, that we restore habitat, provide adequate staffing and funding to really move our program forward, to streamline contracts and funding. I would, both of those past bullets I would put exclamation points on, and to coordinate within or beyond the state and to use adaptive management. All of those recommendations are very consistent with the Invasive Species Task Force recommendations and the framework efforts that are already underway. I'm getting into what the Invasive Species legislation statutes asked the Invasive Species Council to do, and this all, again, derives from the Invasive Species Task Force recommendations. We were asked to look at what the harm to the impact of invasive species in New York is. And in order to do that, I think you really need to look and quantify the harm to our economy, our agriculture, and our environment for priority species, and I would say also priority pathways. And you need to engage your stakeholders in a transparent assessment process. And I think an excellent example of that was Dave Adams, who's in this same room with me. He led the 4-tier regulatory system steering team and 4 work groups. They involved a real diverse group of stakeholders that were from government, NGOs, industry, and academia, and a cadre of scientific experts. It was, to my knowledge, an all-volunteer effort, and they assessed and ranked 180 plant species. So kudos to that group, and I think that that was, just a great example of a good and transparent process where everybody on board had an opportunity to influence the process and the outcome. We are asked to prevent invasive species introductions, and that is our best investment. Some of the things that we've done in the last 5 years, we're using federal funds to launch, fund boat launch steward programs. We've used our Great Lakes funds for that, and our annual, much smaller piece of federal funds that supports our implementation program. The Invasive Species Advisory Committee wrote a white paper on aquatic invasive transport, and that informed, they made recommendations on proposing a bill. We've developed best management practices. DOT has done that. I just mentioned earlier, we've been working with utility rights-of-way, and most recently, high-volume hydraulic fracturing. We proposed BMPs in the generic environmental impact statement. DOT requires native trees and shrubs to be planted on their projects as feasible, and the regulatory system report and recommendations really targets preventing invasive species introductions. And again, this is just a smattering of ongoing efforts. We're supposed to recommend statutory actions, and in fact, the Invasive Species Council drafted 2 bills. One was on aquatic transport, which would prohibit the transport of visible plants or animals on boats or trailers. And the second is a list bill, which authorizes the department to develop regulatory lists for non-native species. That second list bill, that was a recommendation in the 4-tier report. These were submitted to the governor and the legislature in late 2010. There are no sponsors yet. So we're hoping that those can move at some point. Monitor invasive species populations. Systematic monitoring is certainly the gold standard, and with any monitoring, you do definitely need some expertise in identification. Taxonomic experts are getting tougher and tougher to find. I think a great example of systematic monitoring are in 2010 and 2011, there were 8,000 of those EAB traps deployed in New York, and there is a map of it, and it's pretty impressive. So other efforts that were non-agency efforts were surveying for invasive crane flies in New York, gathering feral swine reports, and again, that's not exactly systematic monitoring, but that's more informal monitoring, just getting the word out, saying if you see these things out in the landscape, we want to know about it. There's Lake George Asian clam monitoring. They did a lake-wide survey of suitable habitats and have found 4 sites where the Asian clam is, and their ongoing Eurasian water milfoil efforts. And they have some, oh gosh, I don't remember the number, but some pretty large number of Eurasian water milfoil patches in Lake George. There are roadside inventories of priority plants, and those have happened with DOT and with some of our PRISM partners. And the New York State, I said New York State, it should be New York City. I was working on this until midnight, so there's probably some glitches here, but it's New York City Watershed Lands had conducted an inventory, so that is a typo. Detect species early. I think the northern snakehead fish detection in Orange County in 2008 is a good example of this. It was in a headwater pond and down through a wetland and a stream. We, with DEC was lead agency, eradicated using rotenone in 2008 and 2009. I will put eradicated in quotes, but there were no detects in 2010 or 2011, so we're pretty hopeful that that was detected early and is hopefully a success story. Responding rapidly. Rapidly is probably a very subjective term when you're dealing with state government. I think our rapid responses when all hands go on deck and there are regulatory concerns has been on the average of about 8 weeks, and that's about as quick as we can get, herbicide permit and go through the whole process. But this Office of Invasive Species Coordination, developed a framework for rapid response, and I'm happy to share that with anybody that's interested. It's based on the incident command system, and it's intended to help people that are responsible for responding to invasives, and it gives a wide range of considerations. And we've brought DEC's experience with chronic wasting disease, hydrilla, oak wilt, and the forest pests, Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer, helped inform that framework. Currently there's certainly the hydrilla response at Cable Lake Inlet. There's a response to Asian clams in Lake George, and in the past, oak wilt in Scotia. That was, I believe it was 2 or 3, maybe 3 years ago, and that has not been detected again. So, and I will put an asterisk next to this one. Oak wilt had never been found in New York. However, it is not a it's caused by a fungus. However, that fungus is not a non-native. So it was a pretty serious forest pest, but it really was not technically an invasive species. But, it's hard we really needed to respond to that, so thus it's here. Controlling invasive species. We're asked to control invasive species. Well, DOT has about 70 sites in the Adirondacks that it's managing. We had a couple rounds of eradication grants and released about $3 million. Most of the 61 aquatic grants were for Eurasian water milfoil, or the biggest piece of the pie was Eurasian water milfoil. There were 10 terrestrial grants released, and typically those were for Phragmites, barberry, or knotweed, most common invasives controlled. New York City DEP, and I got it right there, they fund private forestry and riparian grants in near their watersheds. And Eurasian water milfoil has been controlled in Lake George since 1986, and Asian clams since 2010. And giant hogweed. We had a federal grant to control giant hogweed, and that lasted from 2009 to 11. It expires in April. And I know the Naya Kraus, the project manager for DEC, is reaching out to PRISM, the funded PRISMs, and checking in with those folks to see if they can assist. And I'm hoping to direct a small federal grant to Oswego County Soil and Water Conservation District for local control in Oswego County. So if you've got giant hogweed in your PRISM and you're a PRISM leader, you probably will be hearing from Naya if you have not already. Success stories. Last summer, you may have heard, or the Asian longhorn beetle declaration of success in Islip, New York, after about a decade of pretty serious coordination and eradication attempts. A population of ALB in Islip was declared eradicated. Fingers crossed. I already mentioned the oak wilt in Scotia, Schenectady County. Some populations of our giant hogweed, NIAID tells me, are eradicated, and I'm always looking for more success stories. So if you have a success story to share, send it my way. Restoring native species and habitats. About 40% or so of species listed as endangered are primarily because of invasive species, and that was according to Pimentel and others. One project that was funded under one of our eradication grants was restoring bog turtle habitat, controlling purple loosestrife using the Galarusella biocontrol, and at the same time Phragmites using herbicides weeded on wicked onto a reed. Another project is DOT engaged in restoring native species and trees along State Route 73 in the Adirondacks. Very tough climate there, both climatically and salt from the roads. So there is an ongoing interagency partnership and discussion to increase the use of native plants and trees that are grown at DEC's Saratoga Tree Nursery. They can't, certainly that nursery is not big enough to supply all needs, but as the agencies work together, it's just a great opportunity for native trees to be grown, through our department's facility and shared with other agencies for their efforts. DOT is engaged in wetland mitigation sites along highways. They have released a biocontrol beetle to control purple loosestrife. So that's just a few examples. Research. We are asked to support research. Research is really important because it helps us base our management on science. And the agencies in the council and our partners have supported a number of research projects, including developing Phragmites biocontrol agent. I think they're ready for some field trials on that, if I understand correctly. We've supported research at SUNY Albany with Dr. Clapel on intensive rotational grazing to control invasive species, and that that's a tool in the toolbox that does not use herbicides. We've done some research on feral swine control, and actually are engaging in some controls for feral swine. Funded a clean stock pilot to test and certify and import regulated European grapevines. Again, this is from a non-partner, done genetics and control and research on invasive crane flies. And DOT is looking at the efficacy of controlling Eurasian bittersweet using glyphosate on cut stumps. So we learn from each other through conferences and symposia, and I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I think probably all of us on this call have attended at least one of those, and the requests come in constantly, and we support and participate in those. And Peg mentioned the Association of Towns annual meeting. Didn't have a big audience, to say the least. However, I think we do have opportunities to reach out. I'm going to be presenting at the Outdoor Guides Association next month, and I know Hillary Smith has done so in the past, so I do a number of that. So just checking off the list of the Invasive Species Task Force recommendations. I think we've done a pretty good job with really limited resources on implementing the recommendations, and again, the recommendations in the report are on DEC's website. Some have said that we're putting the cart before the horse because we did not wait for the comprehensive management plan, but since the comprehensive management plan, we don't even have such a thing yet, I say that, it's frustrating enough, the progress that we, well, we've made a lot of progress, but it's through a lot of hard work and a lot of delays in the, in a contracting environment, a procurement environment, that's pretty tough. So, you know, if it's called putting the cart before the horse, I'll do it every time if we have to. So, and besides, the strategy is pretty much consistent or entirely consistent with the task force. So, we have our dwindling state staff and funding really increases the need for our partners. And so at this point, we have at least 12 full-time NGO employees out there. There are many more part-time, seasonal, and subcontract. These are on the implementation contracts, and we have taken federal grants and passed them directly through to partners, not taking them ourselves. And as again, we support the seasonal staff for boat steward programs and invasive species monitoring and control. Here are some resources for you and my contact information. And at this point, that's the end of my presentation.